On March 28th in the year 193 CE, Marcus Didius Julianus won an auction held by the Praetorian Guard at their military camp in Rome, and he paid 25,000 sesterces per soldier for the chance to become emperor. He was 60 years old, a Roman senator with decades of military and administrative experience, and his reign as emperor lasted exactly 66 days before soldiers killed him in his own palace. People started calling this event the Auction of the Empire, and it stands as one of the strangest moments in Roman history. The throne of Rome, the position that commanded legions across 3 continents, the office once held by Augustus, Trajan, and Marcus Aurelius, was literally sold like property at a marketplace. This wasn't just some weird historical oddity, though. The auction represented the end result of decades of political decay, and what happened that day would echo through Roman history for centuries. The year 193 CE saw 5 different men claim the imperial throne, and a brutal 4-year civil war followed. The idea that the Roman Empire could be bought and sold would help bring down imperial authority in the 3rd century. To make sense of how Rome reached this point, we need to go back to the end of 192 CE, to Emperor Commodus and the conspiracy that triggered this whole crisis. We need to understand who the Praetorian Guard really were and why they had enough power to sell the empire in the first place. We need to know about Pertinax, the emperor who ruled for 87 days before being murdered, because his death made the auction possible. And we need to understand who Didius Julianus actually was before that day, because he wasn't just some random buyer walking in off the street. He was an accomplished military commander and administrator who had served Rome for 40 years. This is the complete story of the Auction of the Empire, told through the verified historical sources that survived from that period, mainly the eyewitness account of Senator Cassius Dio, who watched everything unfold from inside the Senate itself. To understand the crisis of 193 CE, we need to look at what the Roman Empire was like at the end of 192 CE. Rome controlled territory from Britain in the northwest all the way to Egypt in the southeast, and from the Atlantic coast of Spain to the Euphrates River in what's now Iraq. The empire had maybe 50 to 70 million people speaking dozens of different languages. This was the superpower of the ancient Mediterranean world, and it had been for over 2 centuries. A single emperor with absolute power governed the empire, but things hadn't always worked this way. Rome had been a republic for nearly 500 years before Julius Caesar and his adopted son Augustus transformed it into an empire in the 1st century BCE. The Senate still existed in 192 CE, still held meetings, still passed legislation, but its real power had slowly eroded over the decades. Whatever the emperor said became law. The emperor commanded about 30 legions stationed along the empire's frontiers. Each legion had roughly 5,000 men, which meant Rome had about 150,000 legionary soldiers, plus auxiliary forces that could double or triple that number. These legions spread across the empire, stationed in Britain, along the Rhine and Danube rivers in Germany and the Balkans, in Syria facing the Parthian Empire, in North Africa, and in Spain. But one military force was different from all the others, the Praetorian Guard. Augustus created the Praetorian Guard as the emperor's personal bodyguard, and they were the only military force permanently stationed in Rome itself. By 192 CE, the Guard had about 10 double-strength cohorts, with maybe 8,000 men total. They lived in a fortified camp on the outskirts of Rome called the Castra Praetoria. The Praetorians got paid a lot more than regular legionaries. Under Emperor Domitian, who ruled from 81 to 96 CE, ordinary legionary soldiers earned roughly 1,200 sesterces annually. Praetorians earned roughly 2,500 sesterces annually. They served for fewer years and got better benefits. They were basically a privileged military elite. But this privilege came with consequences. Because the Praetorians lived in Rome, they stayed close to the center of power. They saw the Senate meetings, the palace intrigues, the corruption happening right in front of them. They knew which emperors were strong and which were weak, and over the decades they learned they could make or break emperors. The Praetorian Guard had helped overthrow several emperors before 193 CE. They abandoned Nero in 68 CE. They helped elevate several emperors during the Year of Four Emperors in 69 CE. They played a role in the assassination of Domitian in 96 CE. By 192 CE, the Praetorians understood their own power perfectly. They were kingmakers. Imperial succession was always a problem in Rome. Unlike modern hereditary monarchies with clear rules, Rome never developed a consistent system. Sometimes emperors adopted their successors. Sometimes they named their biological sons. Sometimes the Senate chose. Sometimes the army chose. This ambiguity created constant instability. The best emperors of the 2nd century CE, the so-called Five Good Emperors, kept things stable partly through adoption. Nerva adopted Trajan, Trajan adopted Hadrian, Hadrian adopted Antoninus Pius, Antoninus Pius adopted Marcus Aurelius. Each emperor chose the most capable successor regardless of blood relationship. This system worked brilliantly for nearly a century. But Marcus Aurelius broke the pattern. Instead of adopting a capable successor, he passed the throne to his biological son, Commodus, and Commodus turned out to be a disaster. Commodus became emperor in 180 CE when his father Marcus Aurelius died. He was 18 years old, and he'd been groomed for power his entire life. He was the first emperor born to a reigning emperor in over a century, but he was completely unsuited for the job. The historical sources paint Commodus as vain, cruel, and increasingly unstable. He became obsessed with gladiatorial combat and regularly fought in the arena, which Romans considered beneath the dignity of an emperor. He renamed Rome after himself, calling it Colonia Lucia Annia Commodiana. He renamed all 12 months of the year after his various titles and names. He portrayed himself as the god Hercules, wearing a lion's skin and carrying a club around. Beyond his personal weirdness, Commodus was a terrible administrator. He let corruption flourish everywhere. He debased the Roman currency, reducing the silver content of the denarius from about 82% under his father to about 74% by the end of his reign. This debasement acted like inflation, letting the emperor mint more coins from the same amount of silver, but it reduced each coin's value and damaged economic stability. Commodus grew increasingly paranoid. He executed senators on suspicion of conspiracy. He elevated favorites to positions of power based on personal loyalty rather than actual competence. The Senate despised him but couldn't do anything to remove him. By late 192 CE, even the people closest to Commodus decided he was too dangerous to keep alive. A conspiracy formed inside the imperial palace itself. The key conspirators were Quintus Aemilius Light, the Praetorian prefect who commanded the guard, Marcia, who was Commodus's mistress, and Eclectus, the chamberlain who ran the palace household. On December 31, 192 CE, the conspirators acted. According to the historical accounts, Marcia tried to poison Commodus, but he threw up the poison. The conspirators then sent a wrestler named Narcissus to strangle him in his bath. Commodus died at age 31 after ruling for nearly 13 years. The conspirators now faced a serious problem. They just murdered the emperor. If they didn't immediately replace him with someone sympathetic to their cause, they'd face execution for treason. They needed a new emperor who would say that Commodus had been a tyrant who deserved death. They chose Pertinax. Publius Helvius Pertinax was 66 or 67 years old on January 1, 193 CE, when he became emperor. His age alone made him an unusual choice, but his background was even more remarkable. Pertinax was the son of a freed slave named Helvius Successus. In Roman society, this was a huge stigma. The senatorial class, which Pertinax had risen into, normally restricted membership to people born into aristocratic families with generations of free ancestors. That Pertinax overcame this background to become emperor shows just how talented he was. Pertinax built his career in the military. He served with distinction in multiple campaigns along the frontiers. He governed several provinces. He'd been consul alongside Didius Julianus back in 175 CE as a reward for military victories. Most recently, he'd been serving as urban prefect of Rome, basically the city's chief police official and magistrate. The conspirators who killed Commodus came to Pertinax's home on the night of December 31st. According to the sources, Pertinax was reluctant at first. He suspected a trap. After all, Commodus had been known for testing his officials' loyalty by offering them fake opportunities to betray him, then executing those who took the bait. But the conspirators convinced him. They may have brought Commodus's head as proof, though the sources aren't clear on this detail. Either way, Pertinax agreed. On January 1st, 193 CE, the Praetorian Guard proclaimed him emperor, and the Senate confirmed it. The Senate welcomed him enthusiastically. Here was a serious, capable administrator who'd risen through merit. He was one of them, a fellow senator. He promised to respect the Senate's authority and to rule constitutionally. After the chaos of Commodus, Pertinax seemed like salvation. Pertinax immediately started reforming the empire, and this is where his problems began. The Roman economy was in trouble. Commodus had spent money recklessly and debased the currency. The imperial treasury was nearly empty. Pertinax decided to address these problems head-on. First, he reformed the currency. He increased the silver content of the denarius from 74%, where Commodus had left it, to 87%. This was a dramatic change. It meant the denarius would hold its value better, which was good for economic stability, but it also meant the emperor couldn't mint as many coins from the same amount of silver, which reduced the funds available for immediate spending. Second, Pertinax cut court expenses. The imperial household under Commodus had grown bloated with hangers-ons, favorites, and unnecessary luxury. Pertinax eliminated many of these positions and reduced spending dramatically. Third, and most controversially, he sold off Commodus's property. This included the former emperor's vast estates, his luxury goods, his collection of concubines and young men, even his exotic animals. These auctions raised money for the treasury, but also served a symbolic purpose, acting as a public rejection of Commodus's excess. Fourth, Pertinax imposed military discipline. Under Commodus, the Praetorian Guard had grown used to special privileges, high pay, and relaxed standards. Pertinax tried to restore traditional discipline and training standards. This last reform was a fatal mistake. When Pertinax became emperor, he promised the Praetorian Guard a donative, a cash gift given to troops when a new emperor took power. This was standard practice. The promised amount was 12,000 sesterces per soldier, but Pertinax couldn't afford to pay the full amount right away because the empire's financial problems. He paid only part of it, promising the rest later. The Praetorians were not happy. From their perspective, they'd supported Pertinax's rise to power. They'd turned against Commodus. They deserved their full payment. And now this emperor, who was cutting expenses everywhere else, was shortchanging them. To make things worse, Pertinax's discipline reforms were genuinely demanding. He required training. He enforced regulations strictly. He reduced the special privileges the Guard had enjoyed. The Praetorians started feeling like Pertinax was treating them like ordinary soldiers rather than the elite force they considered themselves to be. Resentment built over Pertinax's 87-day reign. The sources describe multiple plots and conspiracies during this brief period. Some involved senators who felt Pertinax wasn't respecting their authority after all. Some involved soldiers angry about the discipline reforms. Pertinax survived several early conspiracy attempts, executing the ringleaders. But he couldn't survive them all. On March 28, 193 CE, a group of between 200 and 300 Praetorian Guards decided to act. The sources don't identify a single clear ringleader, which suggests this was more of a spontaneous uprising than a carefully planned coup. The Guards simply agreed among themselves that Pertinax had to go. They marched from the Castra Praetoria, their fortified camp on the outskirts of Rome, to the imperial palace on the Palatine Hill. They were armed and marching in formation. They weren't sneaking in. This was an open military assault on the emperor. Word reached Pertinax that soldiers were approaching. His advisors and household guards urged him to flee. The palace had multiple exits. He could have escaped to loyal troops elsewhere in the city. He could have barricaded himself in the secure sections of the palace and called for help. He could have hidden. Pertinax refused all these options. According to Cassius Dio, the contemporary historian who was a senator at the time and heard accounts from witnesses, Pertinax chose to confront the mutineers directly. He believed, or maybe just hoped, that he could talk them down. They were his emperor. The guard itself had proclaimed him. Maybe he could appeal to their loyalty, their oath, their sense of duty. The mutinous guards burst into the imperial presence. Pertinax faced them directly. According to the accounts, he tried to reason with them. He reminded them of their oaths. He spoke about duty and honor. When that didn't work, he reportedly offered to step down peacefully if they would spare his life. The sources suggest the guards hesitated for a moment. Maybe some of them had second thoughts. Maybe they realized the enormity of what they were about to do. But then one soldier struck. Once the first blow fell, the others joined in. Pertinax died in his palace, murdered by the very soldiers who were supposed to protect him. He was about 67 years old. He'd been emperor for 87 days. The guards beheaded his corpse. They mounted his severed head on a spear and paraded it through the streets. This sent a message to Rome that the Praetorian Guard had killed another emperor, and they had the power to choose the next one. But now the guards faced a serious problem. They'd just murdered the emperor without having a replacement ready. This was different from the assassination of Commodus, which had been carefully planned with Pertinax waiting in the wings. The Praetorian Guard had acted impulsively, and now they needed to find a new emperor immediately. If they took too long, the Senate might take charge. The other legions stationed throughout the empire might march on Rome to punish them for murdering the emperor. Provincial governors with their own legions might declare themselves emperor and wage war on the murderous Praetorians. The guards needed someone quickly, but this time they decided they'd make that someone pay for the privilege. The Praetorian Guard was going to auction off the Roman Empire. The Praetorian Guard returned to their fortified camp, the Castra Praetoria, still on March 28th. They had Pertinax's head on a spear. They'd just committed regicide, and now they needed to turn their crime into an opportunity. The decision to hold an auction seems to have been made collectively by the Guard. There's no evidence of a single leader or mastermind. Instead, the sources suggest this was a group decision by soldiers who'd realized their own power. They'd killed the emperor. They could choose the next one. Why not profit from it? The Castra Praetoria was a fortified military camp located just outside Rome's Servian walls. Sejanus, the Praetorian prefect under Emperor Tiberius, had built it in 23 CE. The camp covered about 17 hectares and was surrounded by walls about 4 meters high. It housed the roughly 8,000 men of the Praetorian Guard in barracks organized by cohort. Inside these walls, the guards announced they'd sell the imperial throne to the highest bidder. Word of the auction spread quickly through Rome. The sources described chaos in the city. Senators were terrified. The Roman mob was furious. Everyone understood that what the Praetorians were doing was unprecedented and shameful, but no one had the military force to stop them. The only regular military units in Rome itself were the Praetorians and the smaller urban cohorts, which were basically police forces. The legions were all stationed on the frontiers, weeks of marching away. 2 men decided to compete for the throne. The first was Titus Flavius Claudius Sulpianus. He was Pertinax's father-in-law, married to Pertinax's daughter. This family connection was both helpful and harmful. On one hand, it gave him a claim of continuity with the murdered emperor. On the other hand, it meant he might seek revenge against the Praetorians for killing his son-in-law. Sulpianus held a powerful position as prefect of Rome, the city's chief magistrate and police commander. Pertinax himself had held this role before becoming emperor. It was one of the highest offices in the empire, typically given to trusted senators. Most importantly, Sulpianus was already inside the Praetorian camp when the auction began. He'd been there on official business, or maybe he'd rushed there immediately upon hearing of Pertinax's death, hoping to secure the Praetorians' support for his own claim. Either way, his position inside the camp gave him a huge tactical advantage. He could speak directly to the soldiers. He could make his case face to face. He could physically hand over money if necessary. The second bidder was Marcus Didius Julianus. We'll discuss his full background shortly, but for now what matters is that he was outside the camp gates when the auction began. The sources describe how Julianus learned about the auction. He was at home, possibly at dinner, when word reached him that the Praetorian Guard was selling the imperial throne. His wife and daughter reportedly urged him to go. They saw this as an opportunity that might never come again. Julianus was 60 years old, near the end of his career. He'd been consul. He'd governed Marcus Didius Severus Julianus was born on January 29th or 30th in the year 133 CE in Mediolanum, modern Milan in northern Italy. He came from a respected family with significant wealth and political connections. His father was Quintus Petronius Didius Severus, a high-ranking official from Milan. His mother was Aemilia Clara, who came from Hadramedum in North Africa, modern Sousse in Tunisia. Through his mother, Julianus was related to Salvius Julianus, one of the most prominent jurists of the Antonine period. This family connection gave young Julianus access to the highest circles of Roman society. In fact, Julianus's family connections were so impressive that he was raised in the household of Domitia Lucilla, the mother of Emperor Marcus Aurelius. This wasn't adoption in the formal sense, but it was a significant honor. Wealthy Roman families sometimes took in the children of other aristocratic families to provide them with education and connections. Being raised in the household of the future emperor's mother was an extraordinary privilege. This background gave Julianus every advantage imaginable. He had wealth, connections, education, and proximity to power. He entered public service at a young age and had a remarkably successful career spanning 4 decades before the auction of 193 CE. Julianus began his political career as a quaestor, the lowest rung on the senatorial career ladder. Remarkably, he was allowed to serve as quaestor a year before the legal minimum age, a special favor granted by the emperor in recognition of his family status. After his quaestorship, Julianus entered military service. He was appointed commander of Legio 22nd Primigenia, the 22nd Legion, stationed in Germania. This was a significant command for a young officer. The 22nd Legion was based in Mogontiacum, modern Mainz in Germany, and was responsible for defending the Roman frontier along the Rhine River. After his legion command, Julianus was appointed governor of Gallia Belgica, a province that covered parts of modern Belgium, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and northern France. During his governorship, Julianus achieved his first major military victory. The Chauci, a Germanic tribe from the North Sea coast, invaded the province. Julianus successfully defended against this invasion and drove the Chauci back across the frontier. He followed this success with a campaign against another Germanic tribe, the Chatti, who lived east of the Rhine in modern central Germany. Julianus defeated the Chatti in battle, further building his military reputation. These victories brought Julianus the Emperor Marcus Aurelius's attention. In the year 175 CE, Julianus was appointed consul, one of the highest honors in Rome. He served as consul alongside another rising military commander, Publius Helvius Pertinax, the same man whose murder would make the auction possible 18 years later. Think about the irony of that for a moment. In 175 CE, Didius Julianus and Pertinax were colleagues and probably friends, both being rewarded with military success with Rome's most prestigious magistracy. In 193 CE, Julianus would buy the imperial throne from the murderers of that same colleague. After his consulship, Julianus continued to receive major appointments. He was made governor of Dalmatia, a province on the Adriatic coast covering parts of modern Croatia, Bosnia, and Montenegro. He then served as governor of Germania Inferior, the lower Rhine frontier region. At some point during these years, Julianus ran into trouble with Emperor Commodus. The sources tell us he was accused of conspiring against Commodus and was briefly exiled to Milan, his hometown. But when the case went to trial, the jury acquitted Julianus and instead punished his accuser. This verdict suggests the charges were false, or at least unproven. Julianus returned to imperial favor. After Germania Inferior, Julianus received an appointment that historians consider less prestigious than his previous posts. He was made prefect charged with distributing money to the poor of Italy. This was an honorable position, but it was administrative rather than military, and it kept him in Italy rather than giving him a provincial command with legions under his authority. Modern historians interpret this as a demotion, perhaps reflecting Commodus's lingering suspicion even after Julianus's acquittal. But Julianus's career recovered. He was appointed governor of Bithynia, a wealthy province in northwestern Anatolia, modern Turkey. Bithynia was considered a plum assignment because of its prosperity and strategic location. Finally, Julianus received the prestigious position of proconsul of North Africa, governing the wealthy province based around Carthage. Interestingly, he succeeded Pertinax in this role. So Pertinax had been proconsul of North Africa, then Julianus took over when Pertinax was recalled to Rome and made urban prefect. This means the two men's careers continued to parallel each other even after their shared consulship in 175 CE. By the time Pertinax became emperor in January 193 CE, Julianus had completed his term in North Africa and had returned to Rome. He was 60 years old, wealthy, well-connected, and accomplished. He was a member of the Senate. He owned property in and around Rome. He was married to Manlia Scantilla and had a daughter named Didia Clara. Julianus's wealth came from multiple sources. He'd inherited money from his family, he'd been paid for his various governorships and military commands, and like most Roman governors, he'd almost certainly enriched himself during his terms in office. Corruption was endemic in the Roman provincial system. Governors had enormous power and limited oversight. Most used their positions to acquire wealth, and this was largely accepted as normal. Cassius Dio, in his account, describes Julianus as an insatiate money-getter and a wanton spendthrift who was always eager for revolution, and thence had been exiled to his native city of Milan. This characterization is harsh, but it comes from a hostile source. Dio despised what Julianus did in buying the throne, and his biographical sketch reflects that contempt. The sources also tell us that Julianus had a reputation for enjoying luxury and fine dining. He hosted elaborate banquets, he surrounded himself with cultured company, he lived the lifestyle of a wealthy Roman aristocrat. But was he qualified to be emperor? By the standards of the time, actually yes. He had military experience commanding a legion and defeating Germanic tribes. He had extensive administrative experience governing multiple provinces. He'd served as consul, the highest republican office. He had connections throughout the Senate and the provincial administration. On paper, Julianus had qualifications comparable to many successful emperors. The tragedy of Didius Julianus's life is that he spent 40 years building a respectable career, and he destroyed his reputation in a single day by choosing to buy the throne from his predecessor's murderers. Everything else about his life would be forgotten. He'd be remembered only for the auction. When word of the auction reached Julianus on the evening of March 28, 1993 CE, Julianus made a choice. According to the sources, his wife Manlia Scantilla and his daughter Didia Clara urged him to participate. Maybe they saw this as the culmination of his career. Maybe they were ambitious for the imperial title. Maybe they simply believed that if someone was going to buy the throne, it might as well be Julianus rather than someone else. Julianus went to the Castra Praetoria. He stood outside the gates. He bid against Sulpicianus. He offered 25,000 sesterces per soldier. He won. And in winning, he guaranteed that his name would be associated with shame for 2,000 years. Marcus Didius Severus Julianus entered the Castra Praetoria as the auction's winner on March 28, 1993 CE. The Praetorian Guard proclaimed him emperor. Now he needed to secure the Senate's confirmation and begin actually governing the empire. The Senate met either late on March 29th or early on March 29th. The senators had no real choice in the matter. The Praetorian Guard had made its decision. Julianus had the support of 8,000 armed soldiers in Rome. The Senate could confirm him or face military action. They confirmed him. But the Senate's confirmation was given under duress, and everyone knew it. Cassius Dio, who was present at this Senate meeting, describes the atmosphere as sullen and fearful. The senators went through the motions of acclamation and voted to grant Julianus the imperial titles, but there was no enthusiasm, no genuine support. Julianus's first major decision as emperor was to address the empire's currency. Pertinax had increased the silver content of the denarius from 74% to 87% just 87 days earlier. Julianus immediately reversed this reform, reducing the silver content back to 75%, roughly the same level as under Commodus. This decision was almost certainly driven by financial necessity. Julianus had just promised—
The first rival was Pescennius Niger. Gaius Pescennius Niger was the governor of Syria, one of the wealthiest and most important provinces in the empire. Syria bordered the Parthian Empire to the east, so it was a critical military command with multiple legions stationed there. Niger was an experienced military commander, known for his honor and ability. Niger's legions declared him emperor in April 193 CE, probably within a few weeks of learning about the auction. The declaration happened in Antioch, the provincial capital and one of the largest cities in the Roman world. Niger had significant advantages. He controlled Syria, which meant he controlled the wealthy eastern provinces. He quickly gained the support of Egypt, which was critical because Egypt supplied much of Rome's grain. He also gained control of Judea and parts of Asia Minor. This gave him a vast territorial base and enormous financial resources. Niger was also popular in the eastern provinces. He had a reputation as an effective administrator and a skilled general. The eastern armies genuinely wanted him as emperor, which is very different from Julianus, who'd simply bought the throne. Back in Rome, the mob was calling for Niger to save them. When crowds gathered in Rome during Julianus's reign, they'd shout Niger's name, begging him to march on the city and overthrow the usurper. This popular support for Niger further undermined Julianus's legitimacy. The second rival was Clodius Albinus. Decimus Clodius Albinus was the governor of Britain. He commanded 3 legions stationed on that distant island: Legio II Augusta, Legio VI Victrix, and Legio XX Valeria Victrix. Britain was one of the most remote provinces in the empire, separated from the continent by the English Channel, but it was also strategically important and wealthy. Albinus was backed by his 3 British legions, which gave him a solid power base. Like Niger, Albinus was a capable military commander, with a legitimate claim based on merit and military support. Albinus's geographical position was both helpful and harmful. He was far from Rome, which meant he couldn't move quickly. But Britain's isolation also made it defensible. If he needed to, Albinus could hold Britain against rivals and build up his forces before committing to a campaign. The third rival, and ultimately the most important, was Septimius Severus. Lucius Septimius Severus was the governor of Pannonia, a province along the Danube River covering parts of modern Austria, Hungary, and the Balkans. Severus commanded 3 legions directly and had influence over the nearby Danubian legions in Moesia and Dacia. Severus had one absolutely critical advantage over Niger and Albinus. He was closest to Rome geographically. When Severus learned of Pertinax's murder and the auction, he was at Carnuntum, his provincial capital in Pannonia. Carnuntum was maybe 2 weeks' march from Rome, perhaps 3 weeks if he moved the entire army. Niger in Syria was 2 months away. Albinus in Britain was even more distant, and he'd have to cross the English Channel and then traverse Gaul. Severus understood immediately that speed was everything. If he could reach Rome first, he could claim the throne before his rivals could react. Then he could deal with Niger and Albinus separately, rather than fighting a 3-way civil war. Severus declared himself emperor on April 9, 193 CE, just 12 days after Pertinax's murder. This quick declaration shows Severus had been thinking about his options from the moment he heard the news. He didn't hesitate or wait to see what others would do. He acted decisively. But Severus also made a brilliant strategic move. He sent a message to Clodius Albinus in Britain, offering him a deal. Severus proposed that Albinus accept the title of Caesar, which was a designation meaning heir to the throne. In exchange, Albinus would support Severus's claim and not oppose his march on Rome. Albinus accepted. This temporarily neutralized one threat and allowed Severus to focus on Rome first, then Niger in the east. Of course, Severus had no intention of actually making Albinus his heir. The offer was a temporary fix, a way to neutralize one rival while dealing with the others. But it worked. With Albinus temporarily neutralized, Severus gathered his forces and began marching toward Italy. Septimius Severus was a master of psychological warfare and propaganda. As he marched toward Rome, he sent messages ahead to the Praetorian Guard, bypassing Julianus entirely. The messages promised the Praetorians pardons if they abandoned Julianus. Severus declared he was marching to avenge Pertinax, not to punish the common soldiers who'd been misled by their corrupt officers. If the Praetorians would open Rome's gates to him peacefully, he'd forgive them for their role in the auction. These messages were clever because they gave the Praetorians a way out. The guards knew that whoever won the civil war might execute them for murdering Pertinax and selling the throne. Severus was offering them amnesty. All they had to do was betray Julianus. Severus also made a symbolic gesture. He declared he'd deify Pertinax, elevating the murdered emperor to divine status. This positioned Severus as Pertinax's avenger and legitimate successor, while casting Julianus as a usurper who'd stolen the throne from Pertinax's rightful heir. As Severus moved south through the Alps into northern Italy, cities opened their gates to him. His army grew as soldiers from various garrisons joined his cause. He seized Ravenna and its fleet on the Adriatic coast, giving him control of Italy's eastern maritime approaches. Back in Rome, Julianus watched his position deteriorate day by day. He knew Severus was coming. He knew Niger and Albinus had also declared themselves emperors, though for now they were farther away and less immediate threats. Julianus tried various desperate measures to save himself. First, he sent assassins to kill Severus. According to the sources, these assassins traveled north towards Severus's army with orders to murder the rival emperor. They failed. The sources don't specify exactly what happened, but presumably they were caught or killed before they could reach Severus. Second, Julianus sent official negotiators to offer Severus a deal. Maybe they could share power. Maybe Severus would accept a bribe. Maybe they could partition the empire. The negotiators reached Severus's army, they delivered Julianus's offers, and then they defected to Severus, joining his cause instead of returning to Rome. This defection must have been devastating for Julianus. Even his own envoys were abandoning him. Third, Julianus tried to prepare Rome's defenses. He ordered the Praetorian Guard to train in the Campus Martius, the large open field in Rome used for military exercises. The sources described these training sessions as farcical. The Praetorians, who'd grown soft under Commodus and hadn't faced real combat in years, were not prepared for war against veteran Danubian legions. Julianus also ordered fortifications to be built around Rome. Workers began constructing defensive works, trying to turn the city into a fortress. But Rome hadn't been seriously besieged in centuries. The city had grown beyond its old walls. The fortification efforts were, according to Cassius Dio, risible, which means laughable. As May turned into June and Severus's army got closer, Julianus's options ran out. He went before the Senate one last time and made a final plea. He offered to abdicate, to step down as emperor if his life would be spared. He'd give up the throne voluntarily if Severus would promise not to kill him. But it was too late for such deals. The Senate had already made its decision. The Praetorian Guard had already made its decision. Rome was ready to welcome Severus. On June 1st, 193 CE, the Senate formally proclaimed Septimus Severus as emperor. They declared Julianus a public enemy and sentenced him to death. Didius Julianus spent his last hours in the imperial palace on the Palatine Hill. He knew the Senate had condemned him. He knew the Praetorian Guard had abandoned him. He knew a soldier would be coming to kill him. According to the sources, Julianus hoped until the very end that something might save him. Maybe Severus would show mercy. Maybe some loyal soldiers would defend him. Maybe there'd be some last-minute reprieve. There was no reprieve. On June 1st or 2nd, 193 CE, a soldier entered the imperial palace. He found Julianus in the building and killed him. The sources don't provide details about exactly how the execution happened, whether Julianus was beheaded, stabbed, or killed in some other way. What matters is that it was done. Cassius Dio records Julianus's last words. As the soldier approached to kill him, Julianus reportedly said, "But what evil have I done? Whom have I killed?" These words are haunting in their obliviousness. Julianus apparently didn't understand, even at the very end, what he'd done wrong. He hadn't personally murdered anyone. He hadn't ordered mass executions. He'd simply participated in an auction. From his perspective, he was being executed for a transaction. But the Roman world saw it differently. Julianus had bought the imperial throne from the murderers of the previous emperor. He'd treated the Roman Empire like property to be purchased. He'd legitimized the Praetorian Guard's regicide by paying them for it. The evil wasn't a specific act of violence, but the fundamental corruption of imperial legitimacy. Julianus died at age 60. He'd been emperor for exactly 66 days, from March 28th to June 1st or 2nd, 193. His body was given to his wife, Manlia Scantilla, and his daughter, Didia Clara. Both women had held the title of Austa during his reign, making them technically empresses. They buried Julianus in his great-grandfather's tomb, located by the 5th mile on the Via Labicana, one of the roads leading out of Rome. The Senate passed a damnatio memoria against Julianus, a condemnation